Exchanges don't have to be difficult, but they do need to be compliant. The toughest issues in an exchange usually deal with identification, so how about a little straight talk about replacement property identification? In order for your tax-deferred exchange to qualify pursuant to the rules found within Section 1031 of the Internal Revenue Code, after the sale of your relinquished or exchanged property, you are required to identify candidate or target replacement properties. Beyond the fact that whatever replacement properties you acquire need to be previously identified, the remaining issue is that this identification be made within 45 days of the close of your relinquished property. Also, don't forget, if you have sold more than one asset or property, the 45-day period starts when the first asset closes. Now, it's your responsibility as exchanger to make your identification in writing. You may make the identification to your qualified intermediary or facilitator, or to one of the other parties to the exchange, for instance, your closer or settlement agent, or the seller of the prospective replacement property. It's also important to remember that once you have made an identification and your 45-day identification period has lapsed, it cannot be changed. That is why we encourage you to ensure that you can acquire the properties that you identify. This is not to say that if you're still within the 45-day identification window and your desire is to identify different property, since you are still within the window, it is possible to revoke a previous identification and re-identify new property. Now, about the facilitator's role in the process of identification, it's really to provide a clear explanation of the rules regarding identification, and also to provide you with a form to make the identification and receive that form within that designated 45-day identification period. Now, here at Bank of the West, we also take a couple of additional steps by providing you a receipt when you identify, and also by allowing you to identify through our exchanger portal linked to our website and capable of accommodating your identification with a digital signature. Also, it should be noted that your identification can affect the disbursement of your exchange funds in certain situations. These situations, regulated by what are referred to as the G6 restrictions, are unusual, but you definitely need to be aware of them in any case. These Treasury regulations prohibit you from having actual or constructive receipt of your exchange funds during that exchange period. Only if you fail to identify replacement property in writing within that 45-day identification period can you receive your funds back on the 46th day following your relinquished property disposition. Otherwise, you must wait until you complete your exchange or until the expiration of that 180-day exchange period before you receive any of your remaining exchange funds. We suggest you discuss these regulations with your tax advisor as you decide how to proceed with your identification. Anyway, when you are ready to identify potential replacement property, let's get to the two rules and one exception that you may use to identify. First is the rule most people use. It's called the three property rule, meaning any three properties of any value identified within 45 days of the close of the relinquished property. Then there's the 200% rule, which is any four or more properties with an aggregate value not exceeding 200% of the value of the relinquished property identified within the 45 days of the closing of the relinquished. I've really only seen this rule used when you're exchanging from one larger property into a number of smaller properties. And what is left is obviously the 95% exception, which means you may identify any number of properties of any value, provided that at least 95% of the aggregate value of the identified properties is acquired within that 180-day acquisition period. Also, all the properties must also be identified within 45 days of the close of the relinquish, which basically means you can identify as many properties as you want, and as long as you buy virtually all of them, or 95%, you're still okay. Now, for real property identification, we encourage you to use the forms that we provide, and if you're exchanging business assets or personal property, please go ahead and provide us with an additional attached page identifying those assets. That's identification.